Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 22 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Ottawa Senators and lost by a score of 3-2. And this was kind of a tale of two games for the San Jose Sharks. This was an exciting start to this one in the first period. It was a pretty back and forth affair. You don't usually expect much from two teams in separate conferences because there's not much of a history between them. But the Ottawa Senators, they kind of brought their game. They wanted to play physical and establish that very early on, sometimes even occasionally crossing the line, as we saw Mario Ferraro get an elbow to the side of the head that somehow didn't amount to a major penalty. But credit to the San Jose Sharks early in this game for being able to respond to that with their physical game of their own and making sure that they didn't just get completely pushed around by this Senators team. Ottawa would strike first here tonight with a goal from Dylan Cousins on a power play of their own, but the Sharks would respond with a goal from John Klingberg on a power play for themselves, and that would actually be a 1-1 score at the end of the first period. And this was an exciting power play goal to see the Sharks actually score. I mentioned in my last review that the Sharks power play was just completely dead in the water and they needed something to actually spark them here. And in this matchup, not only did they score this goal, but you would think that the dam would kind of break and that the goals would just start pouring in with more opportunities, especially because they were going up against one of the worst penalty killing teams in the entire league. The Ottawa Senators came into tonight with a less than 70% rate on their penalty kill. This was the opportunity for the Sharks to take advantage, and yet this goal did absolutely nothing for them. Literally a few minutes later, still in the first period, the Sharks got a third power play attempt in this game, and they looked just as lost as they did coming into this one. John Klingberg making multiple mistakes that just burn off seconds on the clock. You have Eklund and Wenberg losing puck races and puck battles down low, not being able to outwork their opponents. You have Will Smith losing puck battles up high. You have Macklin Celebrini over-forcing, trying to get pucks through the middle of the ice and not actually finding their intended targets. The Sharks' power play is just completely out of sorts, and it would have been one thing, even if they didn't score after this Klingberg goal, if they could at least get some pressure and use that confidence from that goal, but it just felt as though it had zero effect on this power play moving forward, and so it remains kind of dead in the water, despite the fact that it goes 1 for 5 here tonight, which is technically slightly better than their on-season power play rate, because it is above 20, or at 20%, which is above what their average has been thus far this year. When it comes to the early parts of the second period, things are actually still continuing to go decently well for the San Jose Sharks. You could have argued that they were even the better team at 5-on-5 in the first period, and early on in the second period, not too awful either, and they get a goal from Barclay Goodrow, his first of the season. Not the, kind of a lucky goal there, but it was off of some really good hard work from the Sharks right as a penalty had actually expired for them, and so they get themselves into the lead. But I don't know exactly when it happened in the second period, but in the final few minutes, the Sharks just completely flipped the switch and went from the kind of hard-working team that they were for the first half of this game to looking like they were right back in Calgary a couple of weeks ago, just making so many mistakes, unforced errors. And it wasn't just one or two players to highlight. It was from top to the bottom of this lineup. So many errors being made. William Eklund on one shift gave the puck away like 3 different times. You had the first line going for just absolutely horrible line changes constantly. You had the fourth line just getting hemmed into their own zone, making huge mistakes. A Stapchuk giving the puck away that actually led to this Zetterlund goal, revenge game for him that made it 2-2. The defense looked lost more often than not. And not only did this happen in the final few minutes of the second period, but it carried into the third period as well. It wasn't as bad, I guess you could say, but the bar is exceptionally low. The Sharks definitely got outplayed in that third period, and they end up giving up the go-ahead goal to Tim Stützle in the final few minutes on a 2-on-0, which you should never actually see happen in regulation. And as such, the Sharks end up losing this one 3-2, not even an overtime, not even a shootout or anything like that. They leave with 0 points, and this was definitely a deserved loss. Now, first of all, I mentioned the poor line changes. This happened on the Zetterlund goal and the Stützle goal. And both coming from the Sharks' first line. And so some blame does have to go to them, but you also have to wonder how much blame is going towards the bench as well. First of all, we had actually seen them take a bench minor penalty on a Sharks power play for too many men on the ice. This is like the one area you should never be taking that. There's no pressure in any which way. So somehow this is just some massive miscommunication that ends up occurring. But while the players are obviously in charge of going for their own line changes, and so you wouldn't necessarily hold the bench too accountable for this, on this Tim Stützle goal, it is Will Smith and Kurashev who actually peel off for the change. This maybe would have made sense in a situation where they had been on for like a minute and you want to kind of limit them having to get caught in their own zone, but this was a very short shift for themselves. They were only on the ice for like 20-25 seconds, very limited amount of time, and so I don't think they would necessarily just peel off like that. You have to wonder if maybe the bench had kind of called them back over to say like, hey, we want to get the fourth line back on, but this was just a terrible moment to do so. Yes, obviously you put some blame onto Shakir Mukhamadullin as well for letting not just one but two guys get behind him, and of course you have to put blame onto John Klingberg for failing to actually clear the puck off the goal line, but it starts with those two first line wingers going off for seemingly absolutely no reason and opening up this opportunity. Perhaps they thought that since the Senators defenseman Jake Sanderson had it, they maybe thought that, oh, every team must have terrible puck-moving defensemen like we do, but some teams actually have good players on the blue line. Jake Sanderson is absolutely one of them, one of the best defensemen in the entire NHL, and he makes them pay, leaving such amount of open space in the middle of the ice available. And so the Sharks, they end up losing this game. Now, they have not been playing terribly as of late. They've had solid all-around 60-minute games against Utah and Los Angeles, but what really stands out in both of those games, it is moments, stretches of time in those games where the Sharks are just completely on their heels and getting heavily pressured with zero response. And of course you could say, well, the San Jose Sharks, they're not necessarily the most skilled teams, and so when they go up against very good opponents and those very good opponents turn it on, the Sharks don't necessarily have much of an answer. But the first thing is to say that, well, Utah, Los Angeles, and here tonight Ottawa, these are good teams, but I wouldn't necessarily call them Stanley Cup contenders. One of these three teams maybe might not even make the playoffs. I don't know. Maybe Utah could miss. Maybe the Senators could miss. Who could say? But I don't necessarily view them as like Stanley Cup, Colorado Avalanche level teams here at this point. But the second thing as well is that it is not just the other team that is forcing the Sharks into mistakes. It is the Sharks who are just shooting themselves in their own foot. It is not the pressure of the Ottawa Senators that is forcing San Jose to take a too many men on the ice penalty on the power play. It is not the pressure of the Ottawa Senators that is forcing a Stapchuk to try and make a move to get into the zone instead of just dumping the puck in, despite the fact that the fourth line, that's basically what they're there for, to dump the puck into the offensive zone. It is not these teams that are forcing the Sharks into these bad errors, but it is just San Jose showing a certain carelessness with the puck at times and putting them into these spots where they end up costing themselves goals against, and they end up costing themselves games, or at least giving up extra points like we saw against Utah and against Los Angeles. And the last thing I'll say here before moving on to the players to talk about is that the Sharks are very, very aware of this factor. I was watching this game on the Canadian broadcast because it was Hockey Night in Canada, Saturday night, going up against a Canadian team there in the Ottawa Senators. And of course, the usual East Coasters, they're not really paying much attention to the San Jose Sharks. So what they see on paper is that the Sharks started the year off terribly, but have been winning a lot of games as of late. So they were doing this interview right before the game with Macklin Celebrini, and they were mentioning, oh, the Sharks are looking so much better. They seem to be trending upwards. Like, how do you feel as though the team is playing? But Celebrini kind of like dropped the truth bomb there, which was basically to say like, yeah, we've been finding ways to win games, but we've been making a lot of mistakes. We're not playing very, very clean hockey, and we still have to get better moving forward. And so it is not just Celebrini, it is the team that is very well aware of the current situation here where they're having these moments in these games, and not just a couple of shifts, but multiple shifts in a row, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Here tonight it was a good 30 minutes in this game where the Sharks are just not just playing kind of poorly, not just getting outplayed, but are just sort of making tons and tons of mistakes that will make them look like an AHL team at times. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks' top trio of Kurashev, Celebrini, and Smith. And not necessarily to get into the details of this game, this is going to be more so of a general type of comment about this first line. As we know, with Celebrini, he has been incredibly dominant on the score sheet thus far this season. He picks up the primary assist on this John Klingberg goal, and so he remains top 3 in the NHL in terms of scoring, only behind McDavid and McKinnon, who are basically the two best players in the entire NHL. So he is in incredible company at this point. And indeed, at even strength, the San Jose Sharks with Celebrini on the ice have been outscoring their opponents by a pretty significant margin. Coming into tonight's game, he was a +7 in that area, 19 5-on-5 goals when he has been on the ice to just 12 5-on-5 goals against. That is obviously a great thing. However, taking a look at some of the more underlying numbers, what we can see here is that when Celebrini is on the ice at 5-on-5, the Sharks are getting heavily outshot, they're getting heavily outchanced, and they're giving up more expected goals than they are actually generating for themselves. And in certain individual games, 1 or 2 games, that doesn't really matter, but these are kind of general trends. And so 22 games into a season, this is a general trend that has been occurring for this top trio, for Macklin, Celebrini. Now, this isn't anything unique compared to the rest of the team. The team is entirely getting outshot and outchanced when they are on the ice, so he's not standing out as like a bad egg in this situation. But as the best player on this team, you are hoping that he's going to be able to get a little bit more actually going in the offensive zone, because right now Celebrini, and by extension Will Smith and even Kurashev, or when Toffoli was on this line, they have been capitalizing on quick strike offense. They get into the zone, and within 5 or 10 seconds they're getting a good chance on net, and Celebrini and Smith are both incredibly skilled, that they are usually able to convert on these chances, but a lot of the times it is them capitalizing on the other team making mistakes. Like you saw actually early on in this game, the Sharks appeared to score a goal from Will Smith, but ended up getting called back on the offside. This is a mistake being made by the Ottawa Senators. Giroux doesn't spot Smith, doesn't tie him up in front, and so Smith is able to get in that goal off of a fantastic pass from the corner from Celebrini. But when the Senators kind of dial in a little bit, they lock in, they settle in for this game, suddenly there aren't these massive defensive errors that this first line is able to take advantage of, and the chances begin to dry up. So they had a few good looks in their first few shifts of this first period in this game, but in the second and in the third, they just couldn't really get much going. And that is definitely a problem for not just this top trio, but for the San Jose Sharks team as a whole, because eventually, obviously Celebrini is going to be able to keep up a certain amount of scoring and outperforming the general negative stats that might exist, but at a point it is going to be able to trend down at least slightly, and for a team that is so heavily relying on this top player to actually put the puck in the net, that's going to become a major problem for the San Jose Sharks. And so to me, the absolute priority for this team thus far in this season is to try and get their first line to actually start to get some shifts in the offensive zone. If you watch the top players in the league, a guy like Nathan McKinnon, and Celebrini is so good that we can talk about him in the same breath as a Nathan McKinnon, he has the ability to also capitalize on this type of quick strike offense, but when that doesn't work, he also has the ability, along with his line mates, along with his defensemen, to be able to dominate the offensive zone and not just capitalize on other teams' mistakes, but force them into those mistakes due to fatigue or anything like that, and to get goals in that way. That is something that we have not actually seen much of from the Sharks top line, and that does need to change moving forward. That is kind of the final piece of this puzzle. And it's crazy to think that despite the fact that the Sharks rarely get shifts like this with Celebrini on the ice, that he is still third in the league in terms of scoring. Imagine if they were actually able to get more offensive zone time, how many more points he would actually have. And so right now, I feel as though you kind of have to go back to the drawing board. Kurashev is an improvement over Toffoli in this top line role, but maybe you got to try somebody else. Maybe William Eklund. I know this would be a sacrifice to the San Jose Sharks offensive depth, but let's be honest, how much offense has this second line actually been generating as of late? They have been used more in a shutdown role, and they have been doing an okay job of that. They're putting out some good defensive efforts, but at some point there needs to be some other bits of scoring here, and at the very least, if your second line isn't going to score, try to load up that top line and see if they can kind of carry the brunt of the offense moving forward. It would be an interesting attempt to at least see how it actually goes. So this was a first line that, as I said, they started off the game fine, but when the Ottawa Senators kind of dialed dialed in a little bit and locked it down more so, they just couldn't find those same type of openings. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, again, Eklund, Wenberg, Toffoli, it was a fine defensive game for these players, but you just didn't really get much doing. Now, I want to start with Tyler Toffoli. This was a game that, at least at the start, was pretty exciting, and it felt as though every single player wanted to try and make an impact here tonight because it was just that type of lively outing. That goes for pretty much every player on the San Jose Sharks, and this is not necessarily a positive or a negative situation. Like, even if you make a negative impact, it's something. Toffoli was just completely invisible from the start of this game to the end. There were some half-decent, like, small good plays that he was making early on, and then we saw him kind of mishandle pucks near the end of the game, but there was just simply not enough of an impact being had by Tyler Toffoli on the ice. And a couple of weeks ago when I was discussing Timothy Liljegren, I had mentioned, like, maybe that puck to the face had left him injured, and that the Sharks should have him sit out a couple of games to perhaps heal up from that, and I don't know if it was that what they decided to do, or maybe they had healthy scratched him for performance reasons, but Liljegren ended up missing, I think, 3 of 4 games, and now he's come back, as he's at least looked a little bit better if we go back to the last game against Los Angeles where he was one of the Sharks' best defensemen, and it feels as though the Sharks might have to take this same approach with Tyler Toffoli. It seems as though he is playing through something. Warsofsky has mentioned as much, and right now he's just not a positive impact player, or even an impact player whatsoever for the San Jose Sharks. You're just not actually getting anything out of him, and so at this point, perhaps, since the Sharks are still at home right now, toss him on the injured reserve, have him sit out like a week or a couple of weeks, try to get him to get into a better position here, because if you're going through the next 60 games of this season with this Tyler Toffoli, you're not going to accomplish much of anything with him, and try to maybe either put like Colin Graf up to the second line again, or maybe even make a call up from the San Jose Barracuda, get some offensive player there. Chernyshov and Musty have both been putting up a good amount of points in the AHL. Maybe you can work them onto a second line role, or at least try them onto a third line role, something like that, because right now Tyler Toffoli is not providing anything to this team, and while the Sharks are being able to hold on due to some actually like somewhat decent defensive play at times through these games, and obviously some really solid goaltending, their offense is just not getting enough doing, and that starts with this Sharks second line that Toffoli is at least 1/3 of. When it comes to the other 2 players on this line, I actually didn't think they were terrible. Like, Eklund and Wenberg both had some decent moments, both had some impact moments, some mistakes as well. I mentioned earlier on, Eklund had one particular shift near the end of the second period where he gave the puck away like 3 times attempting to clear the zone. That was not pretty to watch, but generally across 60 minutes, I don't think Eklund was necessarily bad, but it was something that I mentioned previously and the game before. Basically, since he's come back from injury, this is a player who is not just relied on defensively, he is relied on offensively. He is the 3rd best offensive player for the Sharks after Celebrini and Smith, and they're not getting anything from him currently in that particular area. So it's great to be fine in your own end, but you got to be able to contribute elsewhere as well. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, Gaudette, Dellandrea, and Graf, not quite as good as the previous game, but I do still think there were a good amount of positives from all 3 of these players. Dellandrea's game I definitely liked. He was quite physical, quite engaged. We saw at one point he managed to actually strip the puck from Stützle at center ice and then try to go the other way, gets slashed, gets a penalty call, draws a power play, which is useless for the San Jose Sharks these days, but is a positive nonetheless for Ty Dellandrea, and so I liked his performance here tonight. Gaudette, I thought, was relatively engaged, didn't get too many great chances, but he had some physical moments for sure, and then Colin Graf maintains strong play on the San Jose Sharks penalty kill, had a couple of okay moments offensively, so there wasn't a ton doing for this third line, but they were still alright. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, I don't think there is a trio that exemplified more the kind of tale of 2 games than this fourth line, because back in the first period, they looked very good. This was perhaps one of the Sharks' best lines in that first 20 minutes. Reeves was playing quite well, which was, I don't want to say it's surprising, but from like an offensive perspective, it's not what you expect from him. Ostapchuk looked like he was having his own type of revenge game, looking to try and get a goal here, or his first point even as a San Jose Shark in this one against his former team. And even Barclay Goodrow looked rather solid in these first period, but it completely fell off a cliff in the second and third period. It felt as though the fourth line just always found themselves having to defend in the final 40 minutes here, and so it ended up being a not particularly good game whatsoever for this trio, despite the strong start that they had. The only thing that actually ended up happening positively for the fourth line was Ryan Reeves getting into a fight with Hodgson, which was the player who had elbowed Mario Ferraro in the side of the head, and Ryan Reeves was very clearly winning that fight, and we probably would have seen him win it even harder had the linesman not stepped in and basically saved Hodgson from perhaps another injury like we saw when Ryan Reeves fought Matt Rempe earlier on into the year. Rempe hasn't even played another game since then, if I'm not mistaken. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, here we have the top pairing of Orlov and Liljegren. They had played rather well in the last game against the Los Angeles Kings, and coming into tonight, it didn't quite carry forward. Liljegren, I didn't think was particularly good in this one. Some poor reads, I would say, on that bad line change coming from the Sharks' first line, the Zetterlund goal. This is a moment where Liljegren is definitely put into a tough spot, but he just makes an incorrect decision at that point and puts Orlov into a really difficult spot as well. And Orlov himself, I don't think necessarily had all that great of a game, so not the best outing for this top pairing. The second pairing, I'll start with the positive, because Mario Ferraro continues to be relatively solid here for the San Jose Sharks. There were definitely a couple of mistakes that did sneak into his game in the second and in the third period, so this was far from being a perfect outing for Mario Ferraro, but his penalty killing I thought was very good. His shift that actually led to this Barclay Goodrow game was extremely impressive. Not only was he stuffing entries from the Ottawa Senators a couple of times there, but then has the energy to join in on the rush, to beat his man up the ice, to get this shot on net that leads to the rebound and the puck going into the back of the net. So you have to commend Mario Ferraro for that effort, and I continue to appreciate it. I think you could certainly make the argument he was the Sharks' best defenseman on the night. But the negatives of this second pairing, of course, come with John Klingberg. Now, he does score, and it looked like that could be the thing that gets the monkey off of his back and kind of reawakens John Klingberg and gets him playing the right way, because this first period was not too bad for him. There were a couple of defensive mistakes, like just giving the puck up in his own zone, but as I've mentioned time and time again with Klingberg, you're okay with the defensive errors if it actually is overwritten by the strong offensive moments, and him actually getting a good shot that led to a tip-in from Kurashev that ends up hitting the post. That was a nice one, a good shift for him in the offensive zone. And then also scoring this goal on the power play, like that was clearly managing to make him look better than the errors that he had. But as this game wore on, the offense completely dried up and the defensive errors just got pushed to the forefront, pushed to the main stage, and it ended up being a really bad game for John Klingberg in these last couple of periods. First of all, the power play, I already mentioned earlier on, like, how does he go from scoring that goal? You would think that would give him the confidence to then just making multiple mistakes on the Sharks power play just a few minutes later that cost them any sort of chance of actually trying to take a lead into the second period. And then the two next power plays that they got for the rest of the game, he was no better. So it felt as though that goal gave him absolutely no juice and in fact took some away from him for the rest of this game. And then, of course, the big one I guess many people will talk about is on this Stützle goal. It is not necessarily his fault that this 2-on-1 happens. It is the line change first. It is then Mukhamadullin second. But Klingberg has the opportunity to clear this puck off of the goal line. And for whatever reason, he hesitates. I have no idea what's going through his mind at this point. Maybe he just sort of like misses it or something. Or I can't even begin to fathom what could have possibly occurred there. But he just sort of like pauses on it for half a second, which allows Stützle to come in, push that puck in himself. And that costs the Sharks the game. And so it's hard to necessarily put so much blame onto Klingberg for that specific moment, but with 5 or 6 minutes left on the clock in a tie game like that, you have to take some responsibility as well, and that was not a good look. But it was other defensive errors that really end up doing him in, and so this was not a positive game for John Klingberg, and you have to wonder, like, he was a healthy scratch a couple of games ago. I don't think that the Sharks will have him sit for the next one, as unfortunately as that may sound, but this is not necessarily a player who should be playing with much of a leash at this point. And this is not the type of game, despite the goal, which is crazy to say, on the power play, this is not the type of game that actually sort of buys him more time, or at least it shouldn't buy him more time. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, this is where we had our one substitution of the night. Dickinson steps out unsurprisingly, not only did he not play particularly well in the last one against Los Angeles, but this is also the first half of a back-to-back here. They'll play again tomorrow, the San Jose Sharks will, and so Dickinson, it was probably an absolute certainty that he would not be playing in this one, as unfortunate as that is. Mukhamadullin steps in. I thought Mukhamadullin was having a good game up until that major mistake, and the problem here is that this is kind of the same type of mistake that he made in his last game against the Utah Mammoth when he gave up that goal to JJ Peterka. It's him at the blue line getting caught flat-footed and a guy sneaking in behind him, and you wonder if is this the pre-scout on a guy like Shakir Mukhamadullin, because now two players are able to do that. Again, like I mentioned with Klingberg, you put more so the blame onto the Sharks line change, which was just absolutely awful, leaving that middle part of the ice completely wide open, but still Mukhamadullin needs to keep his legs moving, needs to keep his head on a swivel there to actually be able to notice this situation and be able to actually defend it better than what he has done. So this is a player who is playing, 90% of the time quite well, but these 10% of the times that end up in the Sharks' back of the net, that's just simply not good enough. When it comes to his defensive partner, Vincent Desharnais had a couple of mistakes here, but I thought generally had an alright game. He, kind of like with Mukhamadullin, played well 90% of the time, but he didn't make any major mistakes, and generally ended up being kind of like 100% of the time. Some solid work on the Sharks' penalty kill as well, besides the first goal that the Ottawa Senators did end up scoring here, and so can't be too upset with him. And then finally we have the Sharks goaltender, Alex Nedeljkovic. I would say that he did not play poorly in this one. He didn't have any sort of chance on the Stützle goal. In fact, made a strong first save on the 2-0, and he didn't really have much of a chance on the Cousins goal either. The Zetterlund one is the only one that he definitely maybe could have had, but this is one of those situations where I wouldn't say, Nedeljkovic did a ton to help steal this game for the San Jose Sharks, but he certainly didn't cost them this game either. He did about as you would expect. He did about average, and these days in the NHL, 10 years ago you might have said that 3 goals should be enough to win a game. These days in the NHL, it's not so much the case, but tonight the Sharks were only able to put up a couple. Nedeljkovic gives up 3, not necessarily the end of the world, but it was just kind of an average game, I would say, for Nedeljkovic, and we expect Askarov, with it being the second half of a back-to-back, will be back between the pipes tomorrow. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, as I said, the very next day. Another pretty early game for themselves as they go up against the Boston Bruins. The Bruins have had a surprising season thus far. I think everybody, including myself, were expecting them to take a bit of a step back, or at least not much of a step forward, considering they finished, I think, 5th last in the league this past season. They ended up drafting James Higgins, but off of an incredible set of performances from David Pastrnak and Morgan Geekie, who leads the league in terms of goals, plus some strong defense and goaltending work as well, the Bruins are actually like a decent threat to make the playoffs this season. So the Sharks, it's not necessarily getting any easier tomorrow, and we'll see if they can play a better, much fuller 60-minute effort in that one. Class dismissed.